A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our audience who are joining from different parts of the world. Welcome to another session in the Sciative Knowledge series. Today it's an honor to have with us Adrienne Gordon. She is a high acclaimed pricing expert. She is a co-founder and owner of Pricing Empowered LLC, a management consulting firm dedicated to helping organizations realize their true value potential through data-driven pricing strategies. Adrian holds over 17 years of experience in strategic pricing and has worked with over 100 businesses in optimizing their pricing levels. Wow, that's really fantastic. She holds an engineering degree from Boston University and an MBA in marketing from Western New England University. Adrian, we are so honored to have you as a speaker in today's session and sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Anshu. I really appreciate the invite.
Thank you, Adrian. Now, for the audience, you can follow the live comments being posted by other members in the audience on Twitter using hashtag Sciative Knowledge and hashtag Ask Adrian. Towards the end of the session, as time permits, we will take questions posted by the audience on Twitter. Once again, make sure to include hashtag Sciative Knowledge and hashtag Ask Adrian in your post. Now, today, Adrian will be talking about opportunities and pitfalls in gathering and leveraging competitive pricing intelligence. Now, the significance of competitive pricing intelligence in today's market scenarios cannot be overemphasized. And Adrian, thank you again for picking this fantastic topic for today's session. And without further ado, it's over to you.
Great, thank you. So as Anshu mentioned, we're going to talk about competitive intelligence today and the role it plays in price setting. It's an important topic because although most companies do have some form of competitive intelligence gathering process, most actually underutilize it. And if not underutilize it, a lot of them blatantly misuse it. So they'll gather data and then they use that data in ways they shouldn't be using it. So it's not even detrimental just to the company that's collecting that data to inform how they're going to set prices, but it's actually detrimental to the entire market that they participate in. So we're going to start by first discussing why is competition even relevant when you set your prices? There's always a temptation, especially for startup companies. I know we have a lot of startups online today. When you're creating a lot of transparent value and you're growing at a very fast rate, it's really easy to kind of ignore the competition because you're probably busy enough as it is. But it ends up that, you know, over time that can be highly risky, and also you could be missing huge opportunities. So let's start by talking about why it's important. So when one ignores the competition, they're really risking repeating more of what the market already has to offer. So the key to being able to achieve pricing excellence is really to be able to identify and quantify value of your products and the services relative to the market. And if you're just repeating more of what the market already has available, then you're not really creating any incremental value. So you're really going to be able to limit yourself and your ability to maximize profit and ultimately use what we call value pricing. And value pricing, most people understand that is the best practice in pricing. We're going to kind of talk about what that is in a minute. But in reality, value pricing can only exist when an organization is creating incremental value in some area. So understanding gaps in value creation in the market is the first step to be able to optimize pricing. So without a very decent understanding of your competitors' offerings and their price points, you're going to leave yourself in a very defensive position with your customers, both in your negotiations as well as your market communications and how you're able to communicate your value. So in that case, what ends up happening is you really have to believe any statement that your customers make or your competitors make regarding your own price value propositions when they benchmark against you. And so it's only through a very deep understanding of your competitors and their prices that you proactively take control of negotiations and your own stories, your own marketing stories. So a big part of that is being able to effectively tell your value proposition. And in fact, you can't really control those marketing stories without it. And when you can't control it, what ends up happening is somebody controls it for you, right? They tell your own story. And that's really scary. That's a scary concept because the other players in the game, which would namely be the buyers at your customers or your competitors, they have a fundamental incentive to compare your value using oranges and apples, right? They're going to try to tell the story in their own benefit so that they look like they always win that value game. So you really need to care about your competitors so that you can capitalize on gaps in the market, those value gaps. It allows you to get proactive and not reactive in your pricing structure. And it allows you to know the value proposition before someone else tells you what your value is. And that's incredibly important. It also is really important for you and your organization to know when you're comparing two items that are of similar value or two items that are two different kinds of value, that apples and oranges games, which you do not want to participate in. So when we talk about competition, it's incredibly important to understand what we mean by the words competition, competitor, competitive alternatives. It's really easy to default on this idea that competitors are really just our competition is really just where we have apples to apples comparison and really limiting our view. But that's not really going to benefit you long term. When we use the word competitor or competitive alternative, what we're really talking about is choice. We're talking about your customers' other choices. And their other choices may be that apples to apples exact value comparison of your offering versus a competitor's products and services when you compare them to your own products and services. But they can also be things like other technologies or methods to get the exact same thing done. Or they could be other offerings in your own portfolio that the customer's considering as an option. Or they could be your own products that are sold through different channels, such as in a gray market. So every time a customer has a choice, you are putting yourself in a competitive situation. And that's a situation you want to proactively control. The more intelligence that you have to inform how you're going to control that situation, the better off you are. So what we're getting at is when you think through how you're going to compare your price offerings to your customers' other choices, you need to not only consider direct competition, but also indirect competition. Whatever are those alternative options your customers have, they need to be top of mind, and you need to be pulling intelligence for them. You need to determine effective ways to compare those indirect options. So for instance, if you are selling an apple and an orange, you need to be able to think about the value that overlaps between those two things and what does not. And then you need to be able to adjust that price of your competitor's offering so that you're only reflecting the value that overlaps. And don't forget, a customer might be considering another option that's not even on your radar. It might not even be a close comparison, but it meets the final objective that they're looking to meet. So if you come back to the apple and orange, maybe they're just looking to meet some nutritional goal. So in reality, they may look like two totally different products or services that you're offering, but they meet the same final objective. Every single one of those things are important in that decision of what you're going to track for intelligence. So this doesn't happen overnight. Being able to really understand the landscape of value, your own value for your products and services relative to those customer choices, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not an event. And you might have seen something similar to this chart in the past, but most people in pricing, most pricing practitioners, they've all come to the same understanding that great pricing is not an event. It's an evolution, a journey. And although everyone might have slightly different views on the journey, it's general that there's a common agreement that pricing excellence it's not an event, but it happens over time. And in the beginning of this journey, most companies base their prices off of some sort of cost. And that's because cost is readily available. We need it for accounting. We need to know it for our own scorecards. So we use the cost as a benchmark, and then we build off of that. And we call that cost plus pricing. Companies that use cost plus pricing, they either have zero competitive intelligence and they're working in a vacuum, or if they have the competitive intelligence, they're probably not doing anything with it. And for a lot of startups, that's where you begin your journey, which makes a lot of sense. You don't have a lot of information yet. You don't have a lot of feedback from customers that you're trying to win over. So you fall back on the piece of information that you know. The next level in the journey is competitive benchmarking. And there may even be more risk to your ability to control profit in the second part of the journey versus the first, because your prices in this portion of the journey tend to be targeted to be at or above or below a competitor's pricing. Usually companies that use this have some sort of target benchmark premium or discount that they want to be versus some sort of competition. So they take an established brand and say, okay, we're going to undercut that established brand by 10%, and that's how we're going to win business. And many times they mitigate the risk of using the competitor's pricing by using some minimum margin, minimum profit level that's acceptable to the organization. And as long as the competitive target price floats above that minimum margin, they're okay with taking the business at that level. So although, and you might, this might resonate with you, most companies that are in this phase use the words that they're doing market-based pricing, but really what they're doing is they're meeting competition or beating competition at a minimum margin, and it's really just another form of cost plus. So what we see is a huge maturity happen when companies shift from this second phase into the third phase, where they start thinking more strategically about their business. And as they gain sophistication, their approach to benchmarking their own business and their business against competition gets segmented. And it gets more sophisticated, most of the time informed with data. And when we talk about segmentation, what we're saying is they're treating parts of their business differently than other parts of their business because they know they can. And pricing segmentation is typically a little different than things like marketing segmentation, although sometimes they overlap and align. And so the simple segmentation, they're starting to think about where are areas that I know I can charge more because of the incremental value I am creating relative to the other customer choices. And how can I capitalize on that? And where are areas I can't because, frankly, I do not create the value I need to justify different prices. So typically, as companies move from this meet-beat competition phase into the simple segmentation phase, they're really starting out with very simplistic structures that they basically serve as a foundation to get really good at pricing over time. And so typically they start with a simple segmentation and they start building in some feedback loop. And that feedback loop starts feeding into complex segmentation. So what really limits the difference between simple segmentation and complex segmentation is the introduction of some sort of measurement and a feedback starting to be integrated into the business. Companies that get really great at this become dynamic. And that's where pricing excellence happens. But you can see through this journey, we start with limited data, and then we start getting some strategy and data, but really it's when we enter measurement that things get really good. And then at that point, companies end up getting their full potential. You can see through this journey that profit tends to increase as we get more complex and we migrate towards that dynamic pricing level. But it's important to know in this journey, it's not really a smooth evolution. Most companies get stuck, and they all get stuck in the same area. They get stuck between this meet-beat competition area and this simple segmentation area. And there's a simple explanation for it, for this rut, I call it, this getting stuck in the rut. And it's called fear. What happens is well-intended companies say to themselves, we're better than the competitors that we keep benchmarking against. We're smarter than them. We create more value. And we want to capitalize on it, and we're going to do it using some sort of simple segmentation. And so they begin this process of building that segmentation schema, and they launch it out in the market. And what happens is it works for a while. And the market reacts, and most of the time, if the segmentation structure made any sort of sense, it's adopted and it's successful. But usually it's not very known or transparent to the customers or the competitors right off the bat. But they start learning, right? And they have an incentive to kind of push back, because typically in the segmentation structure, somebody had a price go up. And so what happens is a buyer, a customer who's woken up, starts to provide feedback. And because there's no data-driven feedback loop at this point with simple segmentation that allows objective and agnostic feedback internally within the company believes it when they hear from the customer that this new simple segmentation schema doesn't work for them. The price is too high, and by the way, your service is not as good as your competitor, and your delivery is not as good, and all the other things that customers, buyers, and competitors are incentivized to tell you. And so because you have no other way to really validate that the value proposition was valid in the first place. So unfortunately, what happens with a lot of companies is they get stuck in this loop. So they move from this mentality that I'm going to beat competition. I'm going to be better than that. I'm going to introduce some simple segmentation. It's going to work for a little while. And then I'm going to hear that, no, it doesn't work for me because my prices went up and I have no way to defend it. So I'm going to collapse back to the beat competition level. And I think many companies get stuck in perpetuity in this loop and are never able to achieve their full value potential. So as business leaders, it's really important to step back and be pragmatic about this. Why does this fear factor exist? Why does this rut exist in companies that prevents us from really achieving dynamic pricing, achieving that complex segmentation? And in fact, it's very much our human nature, right? I mean, if we think about it, it's not much different than asking for a raise, right? For our own salaries. It's hard to do, right? As an employee in a company, you go to work every day, you create a lot of value for your employer, and you're very loyal. But when it comes down to defending your value and quantifying that value, when you ask for a raise, articulating your own inherent value becomes very difficult. It's really, really hard to say, I know I deserve more because, right? So organizations, right, when they're asking for their deserved prices in areas where they know they're creating more value relative to their customers' other options, it's the exact same thing, right? It's, the customer saying to you, I don't believe that you have incremental value versus your competitor. And so then you have to make the decision that you're going to come back and say, well, you're wrong. I do have more incremental value than your other options. And so at the end of the day, they're the ones making the final decision whether they're going to go with your product and services or their other choices. So it's really difficult to break that mold of meat competition rut, because as you're asking for that value, they're pushing back and they're saying that that value doesn't exist, and it's just hard. So as business leaders, I believe the only thing between current state for most companies and greatness in pricing is fear of value, fear of the company's own value, their own greatness. And so that's what this is really all about. So collecting and leveraging intelligence is the only way that we can remove the fear of our own value for our organizations. So it's not even just a strategic exercise, but really a compassionate one for our organizations so that we can arm them with data that eliminates that fear. And it's irrefutable, right? It's irrefutable data that they can use and arm themselves in that communication so that when they get the feedback from the customers and the competitors, they can defend it and say, no, I absolutely deserve this raise or a higher price for that segment of my business. So what does it look like to have great pricing using a segmentation schema? It comes down to having an independent position on the optimal price for any group of scenarios that look similar. And that independent price in pricing, we call that a target price. That target price is benchmarked against all other competitive prices. And typically, each situation is not approached as a unique situation, but rather what we're looking at is for groups of similar situation where customers look alike, products and service offerings look alike, maybe the transaction environment looks alike. So for instance, the orders needed in the same amount of time, fast or slow. And once we know all these things, what we can do is we can use the data that we pull from competitive intelligence to quantify the amount of value that you create relative to customer options. And therefore, what we can do is look at those groups and say, in these situations, it's going to be somewhat similar. So therefore, our pricing should be somewhat similar. And that's why it's called segmentation. So of course, this is simpler than it sounds simpler than it really is, right? To do this well, one must have on hand at all times the price points of their own offering relative to all of those competitive options in any type of scenario, for any type of customer, any product or service that you offer, any transactional environment. So you also must be able to think strategically about it and say which segment any scenario might fall in, which takes a lot of strategic thought. So it's a very difficult exercise to think about all these different options, understand that they all are reference points that your customers are using, and then be able to derive that into a target price. However, companies that do this, it's well worth the effort. They typically drive an incremental net profit of 2 to 6 points by doing this exercise. And so even though it sounds overwhelming, it really can be done through a process that's very tangible. And remember, this is all about getting out of that meet-beat competition rut, right? So we're trying to get to this idea of pricing excellence, this value pricing where we know a target price for every simple segment of our business so that we can remove that fear and we can grow those profits. It's really a systematic business process, not like any other, right? Not unlike others. We have to start by stating our objectives, that we want to help the organization justify the process, remove the sales force fear to enable them to move from that meet-beat competition mentality to the value-based pricing and selling strategy. So that's a clear objective for most companies that want to get out of the meet-beat competition rut. Sub-goals that you might have at that particular point might be things like identifying competitor gaps and areas of risk that support a high-level objective of removing fear by offering irrefutable areas that price is a secondary factor, right? So areas where we know we can price higher because the competitors don't participate there, or areas that we know we can't because we have value risk because we overlap our competition exactly. We're on exact apples to apples comparison. One of the biggest constraint companies face when embarking on a competitive pricing intelligence gathering initiative is how they're going to afford it. So who will be responsible and how much money is going to be dedicated to the process? I personally come from the camp that some intelligence is better than no intelligence, right? So this effort could be as simple as just coordinating your sales team to bring in the voice of customer using some, basic question and answer qualitative research, to some really detailed quantitative pricing research that is multi-phased and brings in third parties. So we'll talk about some methods in a minute, but again, doing something is better than nothing. The other thing is, and we'll talk about this as well, there's so much information available on the internet today. This is the most price transparent time in our lives. And a lot of this information can be gathered from the internet through low cost methods. Where a lot of companies fall down in the process as they're starting to try to roll out a competitive intelligence initiative is they don't think through how they're going to collect the data in a way that's going to be used consistently to tell a story later. And remember, this is all about gathering data to remove fear so that we can find areas of our business that we can capitalize on. So this is a key step in the process, is whatever data is collected needs to be in a format that's easy to use and easy to query later. It should be some sort of centralized database, and it should be a collection that's done frequently. If it becomes just an event, right, there's going to be some sort of time later on where that data becomes old and we get the feedback from our customer, and we end up back in that meet beat rut. So this process should happen on a regular basis, and there should be a foundation for it at the onset that allows for that, so that we look forward. I mean, make sure that we're going to prevent any tendency to come back to the meet level. This exercise is about removing fear, so the company can build sophistication on how it reacts to competitive pressure in a differentiated way. So once data is collected in a way that can inform your competitors' value gaps versus your own value gaps, it's time to really revisit your pricing strategy. So I personally like, once you get the competitive data together and you're ready to talk about your pricing strategy, I personally like cross-functional workshops to do this exercise. So in this workshop, the cross-functional teams should, basically review the value data and the input that you've gotten from your collection exercise. Sales must be involved at this point because they're going to be the voice of reason, since they're going to be on the front line and presenting and communicating the data that you've collected back to their customers to defend what changes you have in mind. However, that being said, they're also the group that's also been on the front line, probably, for the history. And so they're used to that pushback on any value conversation they've ever had. So they may be likely to hold on to that fear, regardless of data, longer than others. And so it's important to include sales as the strategy is being redefined, but not just have sales involved in the redefinition of the strategy. In implementing the new structure, you need to also know that you're going to be hearing feedback because of its change, right? And with change, you always get feedback, both internally from employees as well as externally from the market. And they'll tell you whether that competitive intelligence that you've gathered is defendable or not, right? Which is really good. So if you involve them early, they will give you feedback that will help you fill in your own holes. So if you need to go a little bit further in your intelligence gathering, they'll let you know. And know that old habits do die hard. So companies that execute changes due to competitive intelligence do best in a process that's thoughtful, structured, and simple to start, right? That eventually builds in some measurement to give some validity to whatever that segmentation structure is. So none of it is easy. It requires a ton of organizational discipline. So it's really important that there's a lot of communication, and we recommend that as you develop a new segmentation schema based on the intelligence, you develop a defensive plan on how you're going to react to feedback. And we'll show you some examples of that in a minute. So what are some methods you can use to improve your competitive intelligence gathering? There's actually very, very many out there. We're just going to talk about a few of them today. The most common used by most businesses is some sort of form of post hoc bid analysis. And these are where opportunities are priced, right? Something comes as an opportunity to you, or you launch a new product into the market, and the outcomes of that price point are analyzed. How they are analyzed, it comes in many different forms, right? So a few of them could be a post-mortem, and that's when an opportunity is lost and the team of leaders in the organization gets together to discuss it in an organized meeting format. This type of post hoc analysis allows the team to reflect on the role of the price that it actually played in the loss, and it allows the team to objectively determine if price needs to be changed for future opportunities relative to other things that could be changed, such as the offering that was used. The next two types that we list here are hit rate and win-loss tracking. These serve better as a post hoc bid analysis for organizations that have lots of transactions and maybe too many to actually do a post-mortem meeting. Hit rate is simply where you track whether or not an opportunity was won. And win-loss tracking uses the same idea as hit rate, but goes a step further by understanding why the opportunity was lost. And then finally, organizations with a long bid cycle, those first three can be not as valuable because pricing changes faster than you were able to analyze whether or not that particular opportunity was won or lost. So those organizations, like a good example would be the construction industry, that might provide an estimate and a year later it might turn into an order. Sometimes in those cases, what they'll do is they'll actually have some sort of segmentation schema that allows for a certain amount of flexibility and negotiation at different levels in the organization. And they'll actually look for the percent of those opportunities that got elevated to management as an indicator of pricing being too high or too low. The key point to leveraging the intelligence gathered in any of those methods is that they all rely on a simple segmentation schema. Otherwise, you would be learning that you won or lost a single instance of an opportunity. It's not really going to be helpful to be proactive in your pricing in the future. And that can lead to misuse of the data in the future and more fear, right? So if you're only looking at isolated events and whether we won or lost them, you might just want to translate that last loss into the next opportunity. A simple segmentation schema will disallow that if they're comparing apples to apples, apples to oranges as far as the actual opportunity goes. So the next type of gathering we talk about is price list gathering. And many industries publish price lists. Almost all of them will negotiate off of whatever they publish, right? And so therefore, there may or may not be a strong correlation between whatever they publish and an actual opportunity or bid price. And so a lot of companies ignore this as a competitive intelligence piece of data that's really critical. And it's a big mistake, because if you make the same assumption that your competitor is stuck in that meet, beat, fear factor rut, right, they're likely to be pricing in some sort of form of cost plus. And this way, when you gather price lists, their published prices, you look at them and indicate how much higher or lower their published prices are versus yours. It can indicate where you may or may not have cost advantages versus your competition. Or if it looks like your competitor is doing a form of that meet beat competition pricing, it can help you understand which competitors they're following, which ones are relevant to them. Those are both very important intelligence levers that you can leverage for your own business and your own pricing. And the other thing is, I know some companies are a little bit uncomfortable gathering published price lists. I can tell you, at least in the United States, it is absolutely illegal to do so. And so a lot of times, if they have channel partners or distributors, they can access them that way. For organizations with a bigger budget, there's and actually, frankly, any startup, there are pricing intelligence opportunities using research. And typically, a simple type of research would be qualitative research, which could be as simple as just questioning your customers on how they perceive value of your products and their competitors' products. Typically, that's done through either one-on-one interviews or focus groups. And so some examples of that would be like Victoria's Secret's. I actually participated in research where they put their products and competitor products on a wall and asked consumers to point out which were the most and least expensive and why. And I've also participated in a greeting card research where competitor products and the research company products were put on a rack. And in the research, customers were asked to pick up the cards and guess what the price point was on the back of the card. So those are all ways that you can do some qualitative and simple quantitative research without spending too much money. For organizations with larger budgets or at high risk for not getting investor funding at startup time, quantitative research can be used, and two simple ways to do quantitative research for competitive price intelligence are conjoint and brand price trade-off. And these methods are really good for being able to do long-term defending of price value. I'm going to go in a little bit more detail in a minute on what those look like. And finally, we live in the best time in history for price transparency because of the internet. So although the amount of information available on the internet can be kind of daunting at times, there's so much. With a little know-how, it can be very valuable, and we've got technology available to us today that's low cost that allows us to pull competitive data in a very massive way. And so we're going to talk about web scrape in a second, which is a great way to pull competitive data for not too much investment. So starting on Conjoint. Conjoint's a quantitative method used to gather pricing intelligence. And in this method, what happens is you take your products or services and your competitors' products and services, and you assign attributes to them. So from a price, and when you're doing pricing research, one of those attributes will always be pricing. There's a type of conjoint called forced choice. And in this type of analysis, research participants are forced to choose between certain attributes and higher and lower prices. And so it allows the researcher to tease out which attributes matter and how much they matter and how much a customer is willing to pay for them. So, by doing yours and your own competitor products or services in the study, you can actually even put in brand name into the study. And basically through the forced choice, customers have to be able to tell you how much value for a specific group of products are they willing to assign to your brand versus your competitors. So typically when you're doing a conjoint, you probably would have like a third party execute it, especially if you have multiple competitors being tested, because they can be kind of agnostic and it doesn't lead the test subjects on which particular brand they would choose for a certain amount of value. A similar and less complicated method that you might want to research for quantitative competitive research is called brand price trade-off. This method basically lets you test customers' perception of your product or service versus your competitors. And in this method, you might break your key products down into a few that you would want to test. And similar to the conjoint, you would code research participants into customer segments so that you would be able to understand which customer segments value your brand the most versus your competitors' offerings. And then you would ask them a series of brand price trade-off questions to understand where their decision-making process is happening. Web scraping is a very popular way for companies that want to be able to find their products out on the internet. So if you are trying to compete against retail, or you have distribution channels and you want to be able to see how the distribution channels are pricing, web scraping is a great process to use. And it's basically just computer software technique of extracting information from websites. So I use the term macro because I guess I'm old. But back in the day, we would write macros, which would allow us to repeat the same manual processes over and over. And web scraping really does that in a similar way, but using technology in HTML format, but basically allows you to query the same information off of different pages on the internet, and then put it into taking that unstructured data and putting it into a structured format into a database or spreadsheet. And so it allows like automation of human processes. And so, you know, from a competitive intelligence standpoint, you know, how could you use this data? Well, for instance, you might want to understand different price strategies that your competitors are using in different regions. And so you might want to, for instance, go to different zip codes and type in those zip codes and then get prices back from their page, or even a Google Shopping page or Amazon page. We've used it for things like understanding distributors and for our clients and how they, their distributors, if they're compliant to recommended retail prices, or are they reacting to competitors and sharing your competitors' prices. We've also used it to identify areas of gray market and areas where segmentation schemas can be adjusted because of demographics. So competitive intelligence gathered through web scraping, it's pretty easy, and there's technology out there that is very low cost that allows you to do this, and most business users can figure out how to use the technology with just a little bit of help. So once you bring in all of this competitive data and you're ready to build that simple segmentation structure, right, it's really important to be very thoughtful. So we have this tendency to want to get a little bit better than this beat competition rut, but we either tend to fall into, well, we'll just use the segmentation that we use for marketing and we'll try to price a little bit differently there, or we're going to try to get really complex because we're inundated with all this data that maybe we try to answer all questions at once. And so we recommend that you start simple and build out a foundation to get complex over time. And the way we do this, we start simple because we know whatever we're going to do, it's probably not perfect, but we're going to measure against it. And so we'll be able to improve from our current state and get better over time. So we recommend, you know, some thoughtful ways that you can think through is to start by identifying where do you want to win, right? So now you know what your customers' options are. You know what your competitor price points are. And now you want to answer, where do I want to win against my customers' other options in the future? And the answer should not be everywhere. It's got to be something limited to that. I personally believe there's enough to go around with that for everybody. So as long as you can think through that area of the business you want to win, then you can build the structure that's going to enable that. So here's two examples of very simple segmentation price schemas where competitive intelligence can be leveraged to greatly grow profit and revenues. So on the left, here's an organization that gathered prices for competitors, and they have three different levels of product offerings, what they call their good, better, and best. And in this case, the organization and the competitor actually both have the three different versions, right? So, you know, maybe these are product lines. So they have, you know, three different product lines that have different levels of value. In this case, the organization decides that they want to win against their competitor on the best category because it's their highest profit, right? And it's going to build their reputation. But they want their competitor to be flooded with wins on the good category. That's their commodity offering. So they decide they're going to compete at different premium levels against the competitor's price for the best with a small discount to the competitor, and at the good for a large premium against the competitor. So naturally, what's the market going to do? They're going to award business on the best line to the company, and they're going to reward their competitor on the good, and they're going to share the better. Ideally, that's really where the company wants to go. It's a simple pricing segmentation. It's different than marketing segmentation, but it's very effective. Likewise, in the second example, this organization has decided they don't want to win on small opportunities that are hard to fulfill in the factory. They want to win on large opportunities. So they set up a strategy that's dependent on the size of the opportunity, where they have differentiated premiums against the competition based on the size of the opportunity itself. And so in smaller opportunities, they're content targeting a premium against their competition, but on the large opportunities, they want a discount. Oops, sorry. So another common way to leverage intelligence is to do it in a manner that references, this is the famed philosophy of one of the leaders in thought for pricing. And he's an ex-McKinsey leader. His name's Mike Marr, and you might have read his book. His theory is that when benefits and prices are misaligned, that market share is either growing or shrinking accordingly. And that's when the price and perceived benefits it's only when price and perceived benefits are totally aligned that share is static. So if we think back to conjoint research, how can we use that to understand the market in this particular structure and then leverage it to be smarter in the future? So in the conjoint research we did, researchers will tease out price points that potential customers are willing to pay for various attributes. And those attributes, right, are also features and benefits, right? They can all be translated into features and benefits. If the price points charged for those features and benefits for your brand versus your competitor's brand are misaligned to the perceived relative benefits of those features, you're going to find that you're off of that value equivalence line, right? So by using competitive intelligence, what you can do is you can plot your products and services on this graph, and you can determine which of your products and services are going to either be misaligned because of the value you're creating, and so your share is shrinking or it's growing, and that can inform in a very structured way where you can capitalize to potentially raise prices in the future. In fact, you can also use this exercise if you just want to know where you're growing or losing share on some portion of your business without even doing a detailed intelligence gathering. And so for one example, iPhone right now is losing share to Android in low price geographies. And it's because their features and perceived value benefits of those features are misaligned from a price standpoint right now. And so intelligence can actually inform that when you're doing your intelligence gathering and be used to help you understand where you're going to be able to grow or shrink your market. So it's really critical that you don't just take bad news in competitive intelligence and react to it, because there's a tendency for organizations to want to do that. And what ends up happening is when you start your competitive intelligence gathering, you're going to find out areas where you probably, the market is telling you through competitive intelligence, your prices are higher than your competitor, and those perceived benefits are not there. And there's this tendency for us to want to react to do that. And it's incredibly dangerous because it almost always leads to a price war. For example, Walmart did some intelligence gathering, and they learned in 2009 that Amazon was selling its top 5 books at lower prices than you could get at Walmart and Amazon. So they decided to lower the prices on the to the Amazon price level, and Amazon saw a sudden market shift, right, based on that chart. And so they reacted and lowered their price, and it went back and forth. And the end didn't, basically everybody lost, right? So the fact is you are likely to find areas where the price is going to be too high when you do this exercise. So the key is to focus on capitalizing on the areas where you are lower than you can be, and be very thoughtful and cautious on areas where your prices are higher than they maybe should be. And game theory is a great exercise to engage your organization in, to force them to be thoughtful and slow in reacting to those areas where you may end up in a price war. And so, basically game theory is simply an exercise where an organization thinks through the likely outcomes of different price points between themselves and a competitor. And there's 2 typical ways that you demonstrate those outcomes. And basically one is sort of like a grid format and the other is more like a tree. It really doesn't matter which one you choose, but in the game theory, players choose possible price points the organization might choose and possible responding values the competitor would choose. And then the profit share for each player and the competitor are captured in the grid. So for instance, in this case, if Barclay chose a $1.35 price, their likely profit would be $5, $8, or $14 for the different allied prices. Right? And so by doing these different scenarios, they can look at the outcome of the grid, which would be most beneficial for them, which would be most beneficial for the competitor, and then they get to choose which scenario looks like it would be the best win-win. This is a very powerful method that's used by a lot of brands. So for example, Toyota actually used game theory to model out when General Motors was about to declare bankruptcy and they were looking at the bailout, they modeled out using game theory what would happen to price points if General Motors left the market. And they actually found at the end that they would actually have higher profit and higher prices if General Motors stayed in the market. And so I personally found that fascinating, but it's a good use of game theory. And another similar method that might be a little bit more simplistic for leveraging intelligence in a controlled manner is called decision tree modeling. And in this case, intelligence is leveraged to predict the probabilities of opportunity wins based on possible price points. And so you can see here there would be high, medium, and low price points that would be tested out with different weights that are put on the probability of winning all, some, or none of the business at each price point. Using this with the competitive price points that you've gathered, you can model out an economic monetary value, or EMV, for each possible price point that you would use in response to your competitors' prices that you've gathered. And similar to game theory, right, you would model out this economic value and you would choose the best possible outcome and price at that outcome. So again, probabilities in this model and in game theory, they're best when they're informed with hard data that you will get from your competitive intelligence gathering, whether it be through a research method or from the internet. So at the end of the day, there are many methods to collect and leverage competitive intelligence. It's all informed by a process, right? A process that gets you guys started on, you know, how am I going to gather the data? How am I going to structure the data? When I get the data, how am I going to use it to inform my strategy in a controlled way? What process am I going to put in place to make sure that we don't react to bad news slowly? So all of that is consistent. The most important thing, though, is you capitalize on those areas of good news from competitive intelligence gathering, and you have a very slow, structured, disciplined way to react to the bad news, because you're likely to get both of them. And that means you take time before you lower price, because there's a lot of other ways to react to bad competitive news and bad intelligence news that don't result in just lowering prices and lowering profits overnight. So just some examples we've got up here are announcing price holds for a guaranteed extended period of time. So putting out to the market, you know, we promise we're not going to raise prices for 2 years on this particular product or service. It's a way to defend that you have a little bit of a value disproportion to your competitors. You could introduce different versions of your product and service to allow you to unbundle specific value features in a controlled manner. You could offer more attractive payment terms or a rebate program. You could take areas of your business where your value is disproportionate to the price and bundle it with it where it's disproportionate in the other direction. So offer a bundle to kind of offset that risk. You can always ask for a long-term contract in response to lowering the price. And the last case scenario is always lower the price. So just take your time. So I hope everyone learned a little bit about how they might improve their competitive intelligence gathering, some of the methods, and how you might leverage it more productive ways in the future. I'm happy to take any questions at this point and discuss anything else you might want to talk about in the pricing arena. So thank you.
Great, Adrian. It's been a fantastic session today. Lots of amazing tips for the audience. I think your suggestion that companies need to spend energies in tracking the competition, not just tracking the competition and gathering competitive intelligence, but also understanding where the gaps in the competition offerings are versus your offerings, and make sure that you emphasize on your strengths and put your efforts in areas that will make your offerings more valuable for your customers. Another great message I got from your session was, whenever there is choice, there is competition, and that choice could be coming from your own product, or those could be coming from your competition product. Sometimes these choices are direct choices, sometimes they may not be direct choices. And I think that's a very, very important point you mentioned, because oftentimes when startups are launching new products and services, probably there is no direct competition, but there is some other alternative which is fulfilling customers' end need anyways. So it's not that customer is underserved, it's just that you do not have a direct competition. Another great point you mentioned was pricing excellence is not an event but a journey. And I think this is a fantastic statement you made. And if I might, with your permission, if I might add one more thing, it is not a guided tour, it is an adventure ride,
Yes.
which makes pricing profession so much more exciting.
Agreed.
You mentioned the journey that companies typically take in this adventure, right? Which is they first use cost as benchmarks, then they use competition as benchmark. They move to simple segmentations followed by complex segmentations, and the ultimate stage is where they understand the needs and value offered and value realized by different customer segments and practice a dynamic pricing regime. I think that's a fantastic message. You talked about avoiding the meet beat fear rut. I think which is where most companies find themselves, and your observation that it is because of fear in not believing what you're delivering to the customers and over analyzing your offerings. I think that causes this fear to exist. Now if I might ask you one question here, see, yes, companies can look at more and more data and analyzing how their offerings compare versus competition, how they can serve their customers better. How will companies know whether they have done enough? How will the companies know when to stop?
Stop collecting data or stop
Becoming
offering
more
value?
sophisticated.
Oh, stop getting more sophisticated. Um, I think when you are doing dynamic pricing, you probably have achieved the utopian of pricing. Now, that being said, what I think happens to some organizations that get to dynamic pricing is they forget the big picture. So I would point to, for instance, the airline industry, who have very sophisticated dynamic pricing algorithms that are leveraging competitive data and their own, but the whole market at times ends up being unprofitable because they aren't thinking about big picture moves that they could be preemptively doing based on the fluctuation of the petroleum market and things like that. So I guess the answer to your question is, if you get to dynamic pricing, you're pretty good. you're one of the few industries that has been able to get there. But maybe there is no end to it because markets are dynamic and changes are always going to be happening in the climate. So you're always going to have to be pulling competitive intelligence in some form.
That's a great message. Now, related to this, I would like to ask you another question, which is you've emphasized on your reaction, a company's reaction to customers' needs, and a company's reaction to a competition's current positioning and current approach to pricing. But oftentimes, there are many industries, retail being one of those, where there is very fierce competition, and the entire market has decided to kind of undercut each other, and the only way to survive, it seems, is to beat the competition on pricing. What would you advise in such scenarios?
I personally believe that you will never win long term if your only weapon is price. So even if you have to play that game short term, that's a high indicator that you need to sit back and think about your value proposition and redefine how you create value immediately. Because otherwise you won't win, right? The market won't win either. So there's
Absolutely.
always ways to be creative with your value though, right? I mean, it happens every day. Different industries, they look like they're mature and that market share is only traded through price, and then suddenly there's a new entrant entrant into the market that creates value in a totally different way. So it's possible for every company to think through, how can I create value that's never been there before?
Absolutely. And you quoted one statement which was made by Mike Moran, which is when your benefits and prices are not aligned, there is a shift in market share. So if you want to preserve your market share, it's not just pricing alone, but the benefits in the form of value that you're delivering that also plays an equally important role, if not more. And just playing with pricing will not help you preserve your market share. And I think the comment you made was absolutely bang on. Now, advice for startups. How should startups who do not have a frame of reference in most cases, how should they go about pricing their brand new products?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer as a startup, you should not go in to launching your product blindly. And so with very low investment, you can get a voice of your customer early on. So I would recommend doing a little research on those different methods of teasing out value, perceived value for different features that they're looking to test in their products or services from customers. And then, even if it means asking some of your friends to sit around a table and have a focus group, try to use some of those methods with them, because the intelligence you'll gather is just so important, and the risk of not doing it is too great. The other thing is there are some tools out there. So obviously SurveyMonkey is a great tool if you're a startup to use something like Conjoint. So there's some templates that you can find on the internet that will guide you through setting up a Conjoint, and then you can execute it through a SurveyMonkey on a Facebook page, right? So there's a lot of different low-cost ways to try to get that information up front. It takes some thought though, right? You got to really sit back and be objective to the product or service you're launching and think about those attributes that might matter. And as long as you can do that and get feedback from the potential market, you'll be better off than if you didn't do it.
Well, I hope the startup founders are listening to this advice and they're making a note that they need to go out and research their customers. And you did mention several approaches earlier. You mentioned conjoint approaches, brand price trade-off. The brand price trade-off is also known by other names: choice-based conjoint, discrete choice modeling. A related approach is turf analysis. Whatever analysis approach you take, but the focus has to be on gathering customer insights and then translating those insights into value propositions and going to the markets with those. Now, related to this, there is a question posted by Mrunmay Matre, and her question is, do startups also need to spend efforts on competitive intelligence, on gathering competitive intelligence?
It was a question. I'm going to repeat back just to make sure I heard it. So should startups spend money on competitive intelligence? Is that what the question was?
Yes. So
yeah.
I think your earlier comment that startups definitely need to research their customers, I think that is absolutely bang on. This question is in context of gathering competitive intelligence.
Yeah, and if you don't have the time or money, so again, my answer to that question is yes. I think you should spend at least time. If you don't have the money to do it yet, at least spend time to do some competitive intelligence gathering. If you need to get to market faster than that will allow, typically I would recommend in that case to do something like a pilot program with somebody that you highly respect, a potential customer you highly respect, where you offer your product or service next to free, and then you work with them to work out the value proposition later, because they'll be able to articulate exactly how it impacted their business and help you quantify it, so that later on you can achieve what's likely to be higher prices than if you were just to rely on your costs.
Great advice. A related question is asked by KRD Praveen on Twitter, and he is asking, can we directly go to value in use or value-based pricing instead of evolving over a period of time to the right price?
That is an excellent question. So the answer is, if you are a startup and you even asked the question, then you're right on. Absolutely, you can go straight to value-based pricing. As long as you do the competitive intelligence work up front, you will be there. So that's a really good question.
Great. There's another question posted on Twitter by Anmol Bhole, and he would like to know if competitive pricing information is not available on the internet. How should they get it?
Yeah, so that's where we come back to different types of methods, like doing research with customers, right, and getting them to articulate it. You could have your sales force try to ask questions of customers and try to gather intelligence that way. And if you still are not able to get any information, what we tell our clients is, if you're an existing business, if you look at your largest opportunities that you have won on your most commoditized products and services, there was a competitor there. And so it's a relevant market price. And so if you use that as a benchmark and start basically building a framework backwards from that on the rest of your business, then you are kind of reflecting your competitive price points, even though you don't have visible proof of it. So hopefully that was clear, but it's always better if you can get the voice of the customer, or you can actually get written proof, whether it's on the internet or on a published price list. But if you can't, look at your own data, look at your own sales, look at the areas of your business that you were highly competitive and at what levels you won, and make sure the rest of your business is priced at levels equal to or higher than that level.
That's absolutely bang on. Even if you do not have direct access to competition price information, your own business performance will have shades of the impact of competition's pricing, and that can also give fantastic leads into how competition is pricing. And using customers as a great source of competitive information is another fantastic approach to gather competitive insights. Well, thanks, Adrian. We're almost out of time now, so we'll stop here. I'd like to thank you for this highly informative session today. I'm sure our audience would have taken several tips on how to approach competitive pricing in their businesses. So thank you for taking out time today and speaking to our audience.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate everyone taking the time.
Thank you. This knowledge series is being conducted by Sciative Solutions. Sciative helps companies compete and grow profitably through its scientific pricing solutions and services. Please keep checking sciative.com for future sessions in the Sciative knowledge series. Our next session is on this coming Thursday, which is July 14th at 11 a.m. Central Time, and our speaker is Ron Baker, and he'll be talking about pricing on purpose. Well, thank you for joining today and hope to see you in our next session. Till then, goodbye.